now in the second half of this story of United States history. And to kick off the second semester here, we are going to be talking about the age of industrialization, okay? Along with this age of industrialization, you have people getting super, super wealthy, right? You guys think of people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and maybe Elon Musk, okay, as being super, super wealthy. The people that were making money in this era made way more than any of those guys, okay? So along with this industrialization, people are getting really, really rich, rise of big business, but then we also have the rise of organized labor and labor unions trying to look out for the little guy, the everyday worker, the common man, okay? So we're looking at about a 50-year time frame today, 1870 to 1920. Here are your objectives for today. Hopefully by the end of today's large group, you're able to identify the impacts that industrialization made on American society. And by the end of large group, I also hope that you understand the conflict between capital, it's just another word for big business, and labor, meaning the workers. All right. Where I want to start today is just talking very briefly about a post-Civil War America, okay? Think back to when we studied the Civil War, right? Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox, okay? After the Civil War, the United States economy is hurting, all right? Wars cost a lot of money to fight, okay? And the United States economy is really, really hurting in the post-Civil War era, okay? Another term to define the post-Civil War era that you might see is the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age. Gilded, all that means is covered thinly with gold paint, or just means wealthy or privileged, okay? What's happening in post-Civil War America is the United States government, the federal government, is passing what we call a protective tariff. All that means is it's going to cost Americans more to buy their goods from overseas. They're trying to encourage Americans to buy American-made goods, spend local, okay, within their local communities, hopefully stimulating the United States economy. Because of this protective tariff, some Americans figure out how to play the system just right. They figure out how to get extraordinarily wealthy during this era, and we'll talk about some of those people here in just a little bit. Mark Twain is the gentleman who coined this term, Gilded Age. You all probably know him from writing The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, okay? He wrote a novel called The Gilded Age, and it's tongue-in-cheek. It's a tongue-in-cheek term. He's saying that people are trying to appear really wealthy and virtuous on the outside, but people are sacrificing their morals in order to gain extraordinary wealth in this era. So I just wanted you to be aware this is a term that you might see this era referred to as well, the Gilded Age. Let's talk about the roots of American industrialization, and there's no better place to start than with railroads. Okay, with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in May of 1869, we now have a country that is completely interconnected, right, from sea to shining sea. This railroad network provides the ability to transport goods and commodities, such as steel, across the entire country, which really fuels and propels this era of American industrialization forward. Really early industrialists, people like that you might recognize the last names of: Cornelius Vanderbilt, right? Vanderbilt University; Leland Stanford, Stanford University, and a guy by the name of Jay Gould. These are some of the really, really wealthy industrialists who own major railroad networks in the United States during this rise of big business, and they become extremely, extremely wealthy because of this. Another piece of this story, I told my classes at the end of last semester to remember the story about these waves of immigrants coming to the United States, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, okay? People in the post-Civil War era, this era where big business is starting to rise, industrialization is starting to rise in America, people are moving, flocking in droves to big cities, big urban areas, okay? Think places like New York City, San Francisco, Chicago, okay? Why are they moving to these urban areas? Why are people that were previously living in rural areas moving to cities? Factory jobs are becoming more and more common in these big cities, okay? And immigrants, particularly those from Southern and Eastern Europe, make up the majority of the labor that's working in these factories. So you can see here in this graph that I've got on the screen, I mean, look at how much some of these big cities are growing, okay? I mean, New York City in 1860 goes from about 1.1 million to, in 1900, 3.4 million. And you can look at those numbers there. Chicago is growing at an exponential pace from 1860 to 1900 as well. And then you just look at the left side of the graph there, and you can see that urban areas are starting to catch up as far as population is concerned with rural areas in America. So people flocking to big cities, more and more laborers, both skilled and unskilled, searching for work. In this era where big business starts to really, really take off, most Americans are committed to an economic theory called laissez-faire. Laissez-faire. Am I pronouncing that right, Ethan? Ethan's from France. He would know. He'll correct me later. Laissez-faire economics, okay? Well, what is laissez-faire economics? This is a theory that has its roots in 18th century Europe, so 1700s, okay? Popularized by a gentleman in the late 1700s named Adam Smith. He was a Scottish economist. Key components to this theory of laissez-faire. Why are so many Americans, particularly those that are in charge of these rising big businesses, committed to this? One, little to no government intervention, okay? That's where this hands-off policy kind of comes in. These proponents of big business say government works, or business works best when government has little to no say in regulating the economy, okay? Government needs to keep their hands off. Let business, let the market do what it does, okay? Let it correct itself, let people get wealthy, little to no government intervention. That's key component number one to this theory of laissez-faire economics. Key component number two is healthy and fair competition. That's what that picture is supposed to be representing. People running a race, okay? You have to have competition in order to get the best products made, right? So they're saying, people who are proponents of laissez-faire economics, if company A has a better product than company B, well, that's great. It's on company B to figure out how to develop a better product. up with Company A, figure out how to beat Company A, best Company A in sales, okay? So your two key components to this prevailing economic theory in this era of industrialization and big business: healthy competition in the workplace and little to no government intervention. Now, the issue that comes about in this era is the creation of things called trusts, or another word for a trust is a monopoly. Okay? These monopolies, these trusts, things like Standard Oil, which we'll talk about here in just a second, that is this big octopus that's got its tentacles around all aspects of American life in this political cartoon. Okay? These monopolies are established to try to exercise exclusive control over a particular product or industry. So in this case, Standard Oil is trying to figure out how to control basically all of America's oil supply. Like I said, in this era of laissez-faire economics, you have little to no government regulation of business practices. And so these businesses that start off committed to healthy competition among businesses in the United States, they start to get pretty greedy, and they start to figure out that they can make a ton of money by eliminating competition. I'll give you a stat here that kind of speaks to that principle. From 1897 to 1904, over 4,000 companies were consolidated down into 257 corporations or corporate firms. So like I said, this leads to an era where certain individuals establish corporations and take advantage of these market conditions to achieve unfathomable profits. The people that are in control of these monopolies are some of the wealthiest people to ever walk on American soil. The people that are at the heads of some of these trusts and monopolies that emerge in this era are called a couple different things. If you see them as innovative, people who just took advantage of particular market conditions and made their way up in the world, you'd call them captains of industry, right? They're innovators. They're people who took advantage of a particular situation and got rich off of it. But if you're maybe poorer, maybe you're middle class, working class in America during this era, and you see other people getting super, super wealthy off of your labor, you might call them robber barons, okay? So captains of industry, that is a positive term that some of these people at the heads of these big trusts are called. Robber barons is a negative term that is used to describe these people at the head of these monopolies and trusts. John D. Rockefeller, the head of Standard Oil, okay? He is most associated with being at the head of Standard Oil. One of the wealthiest people ever in American history. He becomes public enemy number one for a lot of middle class, working class laborers here in the United States during this era. So you need to know that John Rockefeller associated with oil, Standard Oil. This guy, J.P. Morgan, if you're familiar with the banking firm, J.P. Morgan Chase, this is the gentleman who started it right here. J.P. Morgan, he is most associated with banking, particularly this portfolio that he put together of a lot of different companies in America, successful companies, and he put a lot of money and himself a lot of money in kind of managing this financial fund and this portfolio in the banking industry. And last but not least, this gentleman, Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, another one of these captains of industry or robber barons, most associated with the steel industry. Andrew Carnegie was an immigrant from Scotland, kind of came from nothing, comes over to America and builds one of the largest steel conglomerates in American history and becomes super, super wealthy here. Carnegie differs just a little bit from these two, and I'll explain why here in just a little bit. So we talked a little bit about the economic theory that many Americans ascribe to in this era of industrialization. But what about socially, culturally? What are the dominant theories of the day? Well, this is one of the dominant theories of the day, and it kind of goes hand in hand with laissez-faire economics, social Darwinism. The term social Darwinism is coined by a British philosopher named Herbert Spencer. And I'm sure y'all maybe are familiar with Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, right, from science classes that you may have taken. What Spencer is doing with social Darwinism is he's not just applying this concept of survival of the fittest in the animal kingdom, he's applying it to the social and cultural and economic aspects of American life, or just life in general. In this era of industrialization, social Darwinism especially applied in some people's eyes to the business world, right? Bad companies, if they make a bad product, they should die. The good ones, the successful ones, the ones that are being led by people who kind of know what they're doing, those are the businesses that are going to thrive and end up kind of on top of the business world. So it's the same principle of this survival of the fittest in the animal kingdom. They're just applying it to business practices in this era. Now, one of the things that social Darwinism kind of gets co-opted by certain people in this era is some people are starting to use this theory of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, and applying it to justify racial and ethnic prejudices of the day as well. So it's not just a theory that people in the business world are concerned about. Regular, ordinary Americans are also sometimes using social Darwinism to support their prejudices about different ethnicities and races in early 20th century, late 19th century and early 20th century America. Okay. So you can see in this political cartoon here, right, you've got the have-nots at the bottom, these workers, maybe not as smart as the people that they're supporting up on top, right? Those are your captains of industry or your robber barons up on top there, sitting on their bags of money. You know, they're the fittest, right? They rose to the top. The cream always rises to the top. And the people at the bottom, you know, they should have tried harder. They should have been smarter. That's this theory of social Darwinism that's persisting in this era. Now, I said Carnegie is just a little bit different than Rockefeller and Morgan, okay? Now, don't get me wrong. Don't get it twisted. Carnegie likes his millions, his billions, okay? He's first and foremost about profit for his steel corporation. But Carnegie writes an interesting piece. It's an essay that he writes in June of 1889. And in this essay that we commonly call the Gospel of Wealth now, Carnegie argued that wealthy people play an important role in American society. He outlines how the rich should go about distributing surplus money to combat wealth inequality in America. Okay, so this is really the playbook. This Gospel of Wealth is kind of the playbook for philanthropy, right? Really, really wealthy people give a lot of money away in a lot of circumstances, okay? Carnegie kind of writes the ultimate piece about this in the late 19th century. So he outlines how wealthy people need to give to hospitals and schools and different organizations that are supporting people who may be less fortunate than himself. And he doesn't just talk about it, he actually does it. Carnegie ends up giving about 90% of his fortune to various causes and charities and organizations by the time he passes away. Okay, so he doesn't just, talk the talk, he also walks the walk at the end of the day. Gospel of wealth. Well, we've talked a little bit about people at the very, very top, right? You have these people, super, super wealthy, millions and billions of dollars coming in, but they can't do it alone, right? You have to have regular, ordinary, everyday people who actually do the work, okay? And these workers are starting to ask themselves a question, like, why are these people getting away with making the millions and millions of dollars and they're just kind of sitting on their haunches? And meanwhile, we're in here in factories, horrible working conditions, long hours, little pay. Like, there's nobody looking out for the common man. There's nobody looking out for the laborer, the working class citizen in America. And you have enough people who decide that they need to do something about that, okay? They need to organize and fight for better working conditions. And that's where you start to get this rise in labor unions. Organized labor is what we would call it. Now I'm going to talk about 3 different labor unions here, and they all kind of have their own unique twist. Who they accept, who they let join, all that kind of stuff, okay? The first one that I want to talk about here is the American Federation of Labor. The AFL was founded in December of 1886. The AFL is accepting white, skilled laborers into their ranks, okay? I'm going to repeat that. White, skilled laborers are the people who the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, is accepting into their organization. This gentleman here on the screen, his name is Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers led the AFL for over 38 years. Okay, he was at the head of the AFL for a long, long time. And some of the things that the AFL is advocating for in this era, they're advocating for these changes such as the right to collectively bargain for wages, okay? Labor and capital or big business sitting down at a negotiating table and hashing out basically a contract. How much are you going to pay us? How many hours do we have to work a week? Okay, so they're fighting for this, what they believe is the workers' right to collectively bargain. Not just for wages, but for benefits, the amount of hours they're working per week, working conditions. They're trying to fight for higher wages to get paid more, and they're also fighting for a shorter workday. In this era, it wasn't uncommon for people to work, 14, 16-hour days. Okay, so they're fighting for what we know today as the 8-hour workday. You have the 8-hour workday. Thank one of these labor unions. All right, so AFL. That is our first one. And like I said, I'm going to talk about 3 different ones. This is the least radical of the labor unions. All right, so if you had like a political spectrum or a spectrum where you were ranking them as less radical or more radical, AFL is going to be your least radical labor union. Your second labor union, Knights of Labor. All right, this is older. This organization is older than the AFL. This one was founded in December of 1869. The Knights of Labor compared to the AFL, they're accepting both skilled and unskilled workers into their ranks. Terrence Powderly, the gentleman that you see on the screen right there, he led the Knights of Labor union for about 14 years. And one other difference between the Knights and the American Federation of Labor is the Knights of Labor are accepting workers of various ethnicities and backgrounds into their ranks, okay? So whereas the AFL only accepted white skilled workers, the Knights of Labor say, hey, if you're skilled or unskilled, doesn't matter. If you're white, black, Hispanic, whatever the case may be, you can also join our ranks as well. And they're advocating for very, very similar things that the AFL advocates for, okay? Better working conditions, shorter hours, better pay, all that good stuff. If you were to rank the Knights of Labor on this spectrum of radicalization, you'd put them in the middle. And I'll talk about why here in just a bit. And then you've got these guys, the industrial workers of the world, sometimes referred to as the IWW or the Wobblies. This gentleman here on the screen, Big Bill Haywood, is the leader, at least in the initial rise of the industrial workers of the world. IWW was founded in June of 1905 in Chicago, Illinois. And this is the most radical of the three major labor unions that we're talking about here today. Many IWW members and people that were up the food chain and leadership positions in this organization held socialist or communist or Marxist political leanings. Okay, so they're pretty far to the left on the political spectrum. And the IWW, their whole deal is they promote the idea of one big union where all workers are united as a social class. And they are fighting for things like worker ownership of products that they produce. And they actually believe that the system of capitalism needed to be abolished in order for society to become more fair for workers. And the Wobblies were definitely not above using some violence or intimidation in order to further their members' interests as well. Okay? So if you think about the AFL, not very likely to use violence to further their members' interests. Knights of Labor, maybe, depends on the situation. IWW, absolutely. If it means going closer to our goal of fighting for worker ownership of products, okay, and workers being recognized as a class of citizen, we'll do that. They even have a little songbook that they put together talking about all of those things that I just outlined there. You see that in that picture, that IWW songbook. They called it the Little Red Book. So, you can see that capital, big business, and labor, these workers, they want very different things. Capital, they want to get as much money as humanly possible. Labor, they just want better working conditions, better hours, better pay. And when you have two positions that are that diametrically opposed, you're bound to have some conflicts of some sort. And in this case, all of the conflicts that I'm about to talk about turn pretty violent. All right, the first conflict that I want to talk about here today is the Haymarket Square riot. Haymarket Square riot occurred on May 4th of 1886. And it began when a labor protest in support of the 8-hour workday near Chicago's Haymarket Square turned violent, turned into a riot of sorts. So So you have these laborers, they're organizing, they're trying to protest for and advocate for an 8-hour workday. And at some point in this protest, it kind of goes awry. An unknown person, we still don't know who it was to this day, unknown person threw a dynamite bomb into the crowd at this protest. And chaos ensued, killing 8 individuals total. Okay, 7 police officers and 1 civilian. Well, eventually 8 anarchists are charged with planning and executing the bombing. Okay, but they are charged with pretty circumstantial and little evidence. The big consequence from the Haymarket Square riot here is before this event happens, the Knights of Labor membership was pretty solid. They had a lot of members who had joined their labor union. The Knights of Labor were the primary labor union that was protesting at this protest for an 8-hour workday. And the Knights of Labor's membership after these people are killed and this riot ensues declines substantially. More and more people leave the Knights of Labor, and more white skilled laborers that used to be members of the KOL now are flocking to join the ranks of this new labor organization, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. So after Haymarket Square, Knights of Labor membership dips substantially, and they're never quite the same after that. Homestead strike takes place at a steel plant owned by Andrew Carnegie in Homestead, Pennsylvania, July 1st through 6th, 1892. Source of the issue here in this protest here is Henry Clay Frick, who was basically Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man, wanted to cut workers' wages at this Homestead plant. Carnegie agreed to go along with Frick's plan, and Frick refused to negotiate with the steelworkers union, who were trying to advocate for higher wages or advocate for not having their wages cut. But Frick refused to listen to them, and he decided to close the mill on June 29th, and he locked out approximately 3,800 steel workers out of this mill, this plant. Well, Frick eventually hires a group of, quote-unquote, detectives called the Pinkertons in order to basically make sure that no sort of strike or violence takes place outside of this mill that's now closed to the laborers who usually work there. But eventually, a battle ensued between the Pinkertons and the workers, and the Pinkertons lost, and a dozen were killed. Eventually, Frick requested the Pennsylvania governor to send out the National Guard, and the National Guard put down this strike and secured the steel mill and placed the town under martial law. The strike's leaders were charged with murder and others with lesser crimes, but none were ever convicted in this Homestead strike. I'm running out of time here, but this last one I want to talk about, Anaconda Road Massacre. This occurs, IWW calls for a strike at the Anaconda Copper Mine in Butte, Montana. And the IWW hoped the strike would help secure higher wages and an 8-hour workday, but the picketers began to block the road leading up to the mine. And eventually what happens is the local sheriff decides to send out a police presence, and 16 miners are eventually shot, and one of them is actually killed. No one was ever found guilty in this massacre, and it's the last major labor conflict in that area for about a decade. All right? Okay, make sure that you remember to take a picture front and back of your large group notes, turn them into your teacher's Google Classroom.